Hi again, and welcome to another episode of the Government Transformation Show, the podcast for public sector changemakers. My guest today is Jess McEvoy, who is principal at Scott Logic. We're going to be exploring data in government. How is it used to design services, inform decision making, and policy design? Huge amount of opportunities in government if we use data more effectively. So Jess is going to explain where we're at right now. How well are we doing it? What improvements can be made? How do we start to improve capability in this area? Lots to jump into, so let's start the conversation right now. So Jess, welcome to the Government Transformation Show. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
That's our pleasure. We're going to talk a bit about, or quite a lot maybe, about how government is using data in the run-up to the Government Data Summit. Current capabilities, maybe some of the common issues and challenges that you see, and how they can start to improve the way they're using data, whether that's technically in terms of the sort of outcomes they're looking to deliver as well. So a big topic. But before we jump into that, really interested to sort of find out a bit about you, your background, and I suppose how you're now working with government to help them improve their digital and data capability.
Yeah, thank you. So my name's Jess McEvoy. I'm a principal at Scott Logic. I, up until recently, was a senior civil servant actually in the Cabinet Office in Government Digital Service. So my role now at Scott Logic and my role when I was on the inside of government is quite similar really, which is I design and build and run technology for departments to use. And sometimes that's just within a department, and sometimes that's to be used across all of the government departments, depending on what the technology is. So that includes things like identity systems and payment systems, notification services, publishing, and even actually some emergency support services during COVID. So I was really involved in developing the Vulnerable People Service, which was a really big cross-government data project designed to find the people who had to shield during the early stages of COVID and make sure they could get supplies delivered to their doors. So whether that was from the government or whether it was just by getting shopping slots at the supermarkets, it involved private sector and public sector kind of working together to kind of use data sensitively to get people the help they needed to get. So yeah, that's me. I'm super pleased to be here.
Fantastic. Yeah, and that collaboration between public and private sector it's interesting. You can kind of take your place on either side of that now, and it's a lot of the same skills, a lot of the same people involved in the projects. You might just wear a slightly different hat, but ultimately it's around that collaborative piece, which we're seeing increasing amounts of in public sector. So starting to explore, I suppose, where we're at right now. We're delighted that Scott Logic are joining us at the Government Data Summit as a partner, and in particular are going to be hosting the discussion table around data-driven decision making. Now, I suppose most decisions involve some form of data, but where we're really starting to harness the power of data, different data sets, interoperability, all of these opportunities. Why does that matter to Scott Logic? Where do you see that opportunity in terms of that data use?
Yeah, I mean, as a former civil servant, I'm obsessed with value. And I think that's the key to using data properly, is it's all around value. You know, being able to use data to drive decisions helps departments increase the value that they get and can deliver. So they can build better services, get them out to more people, get better outcomes from those services. And, you know, we live in an era where data is ever present. Abundant, and you know, you kind of think that it's there for business critical kind of key metrics to even the smallest client interactions. Data is like, you know, one of the most valuable assets that all of these organizations have, and if you use it correctly, you know, it can help you inform and support those decisions that you've got to make, and decision making in general. It lets us kind of chart the path that we want to take based on knowledge rather than assumptions. And it gives us a tool to kind of measure success. You know, are we doing what we said we were going to do? And that's a theory, but and we all aspire to kind of doing that data-driven decision making. But in reality, you know, the data that we need to do that is often quite hard to reach. It's hard to understand it once you do reach it. And so we tend to kind of fall back on decisions made through assumptions or instinct. You know, we saw that a bit during COVID. You know, where when it's crisis mode, if you can't find it, then you sort of default back to this assumptions and instinct, and we can be better than that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you alluded to some of the sort of challenges that can emerge. The theory is one thing, the practice can be another. So if you were sort of running the rule over current use of data and capability in government, and given that you sort of work for GDS, you may have sort of had a sort of cross-government view at times. What would you say are your main takes on how government, and I appreciate government is lots of different organizations, so it'll be maybe a bit patchy, but how are they currently using data, maybe how well, in terms of informing policy, service design, all of those kind of key drivers of value that you talked about earlier?
Yeah. Well, at the service level, I actually think this is one of the things that departments do quite well. They're quite good at it, and they're getting better and better at it. When I worked on identity, the data from how users interacted with the service, as well as support tickets, the insights we got from user research, were all kind of combined to help design how the service actually operated, how it had to change, what should be prioritized. And it even informed how the contracts with private sector needed to work. And it helped to set the policy around how the data worked and who should have access, right? So that felt very like a cycle with different people having a different role. And it wasn't ever finished. It was kind of, looping around. It was pretty sophisticated at that granular level. On gov.uk, it was the same. We had the data team. They had a huge role to play in understanding, for example, like how the service is performing, right? Because if people can't get the page to open, then they go somewhere else, right? So, we'd look at what devices it was working on, whether it was well or poorly on certain places, what factors influenced page load speeds. We found, things like even just changing a font would have like a big impact on that. And that in turn basically affects how the service is designed, and, helps to shape then the government guidance back into other departments about how they should build and design their services too. But if you look further up the chain, I think across like the multiple services, places where, you've got lots of people working on the same thing across departmental boundaries, it gets more challenging. I think that cross-cutting data can be really hard to reach. And I know it's a current focus of government to kind of address this, because, all ministers, all the permanent secretaries, the heads of department, they want the power to use data to drive their decision making. At the top levels, it's about, is this policy having the intended effect? Can I measure that? Where should I spend this money to deliver the most value? What part of this service would deliver most bang for buck if it got more money? What do I need to give this other department or get back from them, to see the bigger picture? And how do we actually even do that? So there's still a lot of challenges, I think.
Yeah, that's a question of scale, I suppose, isn't it? It's individual teams delivering very specific individual services can kind of maybe be the masters of their own destiny. But as soon as you've got multiple agencies, multiple departments, is that where it gets a bit sticky?
Yeah, exactly that. I think it's about different incentives. It's about legacy systems. People being on different platforms. It's about the rules between those systems. It gets really complex really quickly.
Yeah, all the fun things in life. Yeah. So, okay, there's a mixed picture, and I suppose inevitably so. So, how can we start to help government improve performance and capability in using data? I guess this is kind of one of your key areas of focus now. I suppose there's different factors at play. So, how do you help them start that journey?
Yeah, I think there's lots and lots of answers to that. I think one of the things that's really interesting is that organizations often see big data infrastructure as being kind of critical, or at least foundational to like transforming their business or their kind of day-to-day operations. And by that I mean, buy this big technology thing, it will fix our data type thing. And I think, if you look under the hood, many of them aren't yet getting the value that they wanted to get out of those, or they expected to get out of those investments, especially if they have gone down that route of buying or implementing, some sort of like data lake solution, right? Because data is often hard to identify fine access within the organization to start with. Skills are often in short supply, you know, capability is a big issue. And then the governance or like lack of clarity around what the rules are can be quite a big barrier to even being able to kind of do something with that data. Once you have it, you know, it can act like an anchor and sort of have a drag effect. And I think often organizations end up in a bit of a cycle of like re-procurement. So they buy some new tech to fix the old tech. And it can kind of like limit the innovation that they're trying to deliver. So the tech is not bad, but you know, there's a bit of a cycle there. And it isn't just answered by buying a system. You know, you have to have a plan about how you're going to get value out of those systems, you know, some kind of data strategy. And one piece of it is the technology. It's not just about buying a system, it has to go deeper, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, the technology doesn't fix organizational issues per se. You know, you have to kind of retool culture, structure, governance, like you say, to be fit for purpose for the technology to deliver its potential, I guess. So where do you see sort of practical advances and things happening, you know, typically when you're working with government? Any practical action points where actually you think this is the key priorities to get in place so that you can start to deliver some of that value, you can start to enable data in informing decisions?
Yeah. Well, I think the barriers that get in the way are often things like access, right? So legacy systems, making different data sources talk to each other within organizations and beyond those organizations, that's challenging. And then there's a volume issue. You know, which data is useful, what's actionable, like how should it be combined? There's a quality issue. I've like led like several projects where the first issue that happens when you expose what the data is that's held, you know, on people is that people go, oh, that's not my address. You know, I haven't lived there for years. You know, so the quality is not always there. So is the data even good enough to make decisions with? And then the permission, you know, what can be shared with who, how, like what's the right approach there? And so I think Scott Logic's been like really successful in working with companies and public sector organizations by kind of following sort of like a 3-step approach a little bit with some of these, where, you know, we first locate the data, you know, like we locate the data that is kind of in these systems, because actually that's like a huge barrier to begin with. We spend some time understanding what that data actually is and what it shows and what it would enable. And then we find a technical way to surface it up so it can actually be acted on and decisions be made with. And that's our approach, but anyone could adopt that approach. You know, it's about kind of doing some of that fixing of the plumbing before you implement, you know, your magic kind of analysis layer, because you can hire loads of data scientists and try to layer that on the top. If, you know, if they can't get to the material to begin with, if they don't understand what the strategy is, they're limited before they even get going.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I suppose let's be optimistic and say government organizations and you know, everybody is working towards improving those foundations, you know, doing the data audits, understanding do they have the right technologies in place, getting the right skills in place. So if we assume that we get to this position where all those foundations are in good shape across government more widely, what's possible? If we look sort of further down the line, what could some of those outputs and deliverables and sort of service improvements look like if we have a more powerful, functioning, sort of data-driven approach?
Yeah. Well, I think the aspiration has to be kind of whole of government services. It's kind of like it was my aspiration inside a government, and I think it sort of still has to be the aspiration now. You know, services that transcend departmental boundaries, that deliver policy across borders, you know, whether it's provided by central government, local government, or even private sector potentially. And I think the steps towards doing this are much more about making sure systems within each business area can speak to each other, that there are rules that govern how that happens, that the right protections are in place, and, you know, you can kind of build a picture of, you know, what data and what part of the ecosystem is involved in kind of delivering, you know, something massive like social care, you know, across health, across local, across like DWP, across like all of these different people who are involved in that. At the moment, it's still very compartmentalized. And I think, looking at that kind of cross-cutting picture, not only would it be better at a day-to-day level for citizens, it would also give you a much more concrete picture of like how policy is actually delivered. What happens if you press down on this bit, what shoots up over here, I think that's the aspiration at all different levels inside of government, like, from like cabinet and ministers all the way down to like, the heads of departments.
And when you think about those kind of whole government services, is there kind of something that springs to mind where you think that would be a true sort of mark of success if we were delivering, I don't know what, in terms of that whole government experience, so that you don't rely on citizens to understand the different government departments to navigate their way through themselves? What would good look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to follow the agenda of the day, right? So, but I think some of those really complex kind of life event type elements, like, I need help because like I'm trying to find a job, or kind of I'm having a baby. Like, all of those are like really obvious starting points because they affect, huge swathes of the population. They're a really good test because we have like years and years worth of data on how each part of those ecosystem like elements kind of operate not connected up. So, you'd be able to really measure like how well the kind of joined up view was actually performing.
Yeah. So start with the user in mind, right? What does a service design look like internally, but actually, well, how do we help across somebody's life, irrespective of what service actually needs to touch them, I guess, is
100%.
which is the name of the game. Yeah. So that's a good aspiration. Hopefully we'll get there soon. And I think, what we're trying to do is obviously help different government organizations understand best practice, share ideas and so on, which is why the Government Data Summit's coming up on the 20th of October. And so, we're bringing together civil servants from across, government departments, Whitehall, etc. So what are you looking forward to sort of sharing with that audience, getting across some key messages? What for you is kind of important to have in those conversations at the summit?
Yeah, I'd really love to give them some practical examples of different projects that, different ways we've tackled some of these challenges. I think it can feel like a huge kind of problem, to kind of get a grip of an agenda like this. And actually, what we've found is that, we've done really, really large projects and really, really small projects. And you don't have to kind of have solved everything before you start taking steps into this space. We've worked with partners inside of government where, like really, really critical kind of business service and analysis work that's going on is mostly being run through email and like PDFs and things. Yeah. And, it's not the hardest problem to solve. We've got really good examples of how you can kind of level up from any position. You don't have to have the answer from like, the very top of the tree all the way down. You can start making improvements in a small way, which doesn't cost an absolute fortune. And it would be really good to kind of like, share like the two ends of the spectrum and kind of show people, big solutions, but also some really practical ways of kind of making inroads into this space, because I actually think you have to tackle it in both ways at once, so that you're sort of immediately delivering value back into the business, which helps you justify like making the case for the much larger, longer, slightly more painful solutions that you tend to want to put in, where the value is, a bit further off, but when it comes in, it's massive,
Yeah, never underestimate the value of a quick win to prove something's worth continuing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Win the hearts and minds early in the process, I guess. And then on the flip side of that, obviously, we're encouraging all of the community that are joining us to share, to talk to you, to tell you what they've got going on. So what are you kind of interested in hearing from civil servants who are going to be joining us on the day?
Yeah, I just really would love to have like an open conversation about the challenges that are faced there and kind of like share some ideas about it, because I think everyone's got a slightly different position on this, a slightly different issue and challenge that they're facing. And, you know, there's just a huge amount of value in kind of bringing groups of these people all together and convening and sharing the situation that everyone's in, so they can understand where their problem overlaps with other people's, that we can hear, you know, from the kind of front line, this is what the problem manifests as and what it looks like. This is not just kind of like, you know, a system not quite working how we want it to. Here is what this means at a day-to-day level. You know, it's really valuable to kind of have people sit around a table and kind of realize that there's other people who have the same problems as them. Some of them have tried some things and they've worked, you know, and I think that's like a huge benefit to just convene in groups like this.
Absolutely. We can't wait to bring everyone together. So yeah, it's not long till the Data Summit now. So we're looking forward to welcoming you and Scott Logic on the day. So we've probably hit up against time now. So we'll reconvene in a couple of weeks' time for the summit. But in the meantime, just wanted to say thank you very much for joining me for this conversation.
No problem. Really lovely to speak to you.
So there we have it. Thank you again to Jess for joining me today for a conversation. Really interested to hear where we're at in using data in government, what the opportunities are and what's coming next over the horizon. As we mentioned, Scott Logic are hosting the discussion table on data-driven decision-making at the Government Data Summit on the 20th of October at Church House in Westminster. If you'd like to join those conversations with 100 of your civil service peers, then all you have to do is apply using the link in the show notes attached to this episode. That's about it for now, but we'll be back soon with another conversation with a public sector changemaker. Until then, goodbye.